Eliza jolted awake at 2:13 a.m., her name rising from behind the locked door. The whisper was stretched thin, almost brittle, as if it had traveled years just to find her. She sat up, heart hammering. The realtor had promised the room was sealed, untouched, since the 70s. Yet a shadow quivered across the strip of light beneath the door, a light that should not exist. She crept closer, floorboards moaning, until the wood met her ear. The whisper slowed, savoring every syllable of her name. Then came another sound, like fingernails dragged lightly over plaster. She twisted the knob, but it did not turn. On the painted surface, words had appeared, letters fresh and raw. "I remember you." If the room was empty, who was calling to her in the dark? Eliza Bennett had grown tired of the city. The nights there were a constant stream of sirens and restless traffic, a place where even her own thoughts had to shout to be heard. When she found the house at the edge of a small town, shaded by sycamores and resting on a slope that looked toward a forgotten river, she told herself this was a beginning. The porch leaned with age, the shutters sagged, but to her eyes, the imperfections were a kind of welcome. She wanted to believe that by choosing this place, she was choosing peace. At 27, Eliza had become skilled at living with fragments. She was an archivist, someone who knew how to handle brittle paper and fading ink, someone who understood that every history leaves stains. She carried her own stains quietly. As a child, she had often woken to sounds no one else acknowledged. A door that creaked open, whispers fading when she called for her parents, the cold sense that someone stood close to her bed. Her mother dismissed it as dreams. Her father avoided her eyes. Eliza learned to keep silent, though silence never kept away the feeling. When she arrived, the townspeople noticed. In places like this, newcomers were studied with the same suspicion given to storms forming on the horizon. At the corner store, the old man at the register rang up her groceries without hurry. He asked where she lived now. When she said the Bennett house, his hands faltered. A can slipped from the counter and rolled into her bag. He did not look at her when he muttered, "You should not stay there long." She forced a laugh and said the price had been too good to ignore. He only shook his head. His eyes, clouded with age, lingered as though he were trying to memorize her face before she disappeared. The house itself carried weight. Its staircase groaned like tired lungs. The kitchen smelled faintly of damp earth, though the windows were closed tight. In the hallway upstairs, the locked room waited at the end, swollen with time, its handle cold no matter how warm the air. She avoided it, pretending it was just another door. Yet every time she passed, her pulse ticked faster. One evening she discovered a photograph buried in a drawer, its edges curled like dead leaves. A family stood on the porch, man, woman, and a boy caught mid-sentence, his mouth parted as if frozen in the middle of a plea. On the back, scrawled in ink that had bled into the paper, were the words, "He hears her too." Her hands shook. She returned it to the drawer, but the words followed her down the hallway, whispering even when she closed her eyes. Neighbors offered little comfort. A woman tending her garden across the street called out one afternoon, her voice deceptively casual. "You know that house was built wrong, don't you?" Eliza frowned, asking what she meant. The woman kept pruning her roses and replied, "Wrong foundation. It leans toward the place it should not." Then she smiled too brightly, as if the words had been a mistake, and returned to her flowers. Eliza tried to dismiss it. She planted herbs on the porch, arranged her books in neat rows, told herself that ordinary tasks could anchor her. Yet at night, the house pressed in. Windows reflected her face back to her as if it belonged to someone else. Floors shifted under her weight, and always, at the top of the stairs, that door waited. One night, unable to sleep, she carried a mug of tea into the hallway. The house was still, except for the whisper of branches against the siding. She stopped when she saw something new. On the wood of the locked door, faint in the dim light, was a mark she hadn't seen before. It looked like the curve of a fingernail dragged across paint. She touched it, and the groove felt fresh. From inside the room came a single sound, a breath drawn in, held too long, then released against the other side of the door. Eliza staggered back, tea spilling across the floorboards. The hallway seemed to tilt. She whispered to herself that the house was settling, nothing more. But as she turned away, she heard it again, softer this time, close to her ear, though no one stood behind her. The first week in the house settled into a rhythm of unease. By day, Eliza unpacked boxes, tried to arrange shelves, forced herself to smile at the neighbors who studied her with cautious curiosity. But by night, the house turned restless. On the 7th night, she woke to her name whispered twice, clear enough to make her sit bolt upright in bed. At first she froze, straining to hear beyond the pounding of her own heartbeat. The sound had come from the hallway, from the locked door. She told herself it was only a dream, an echo of childhood terror she had never outgrown. But when she stepped into the hallway barefoot, the whisper stopped. The silence pressed against her, so heavy it made her ears ache. Her hand hovered over the door handle. It was warm, as if someone on the other side had just let go. She whispered, "Who is there?" and waited. The only reply was a knock, slow and deliberate, 3 times. She stumbled back, slamming her bedroom door shut. The next day she went to the library, pretending she was researching town history for her own interest. In truth, she was hunting answers. She combed through old newspapers until one headline caught her eye. "Local boy vanishes. Family refuses to speak." The address listed was her house. The librarian noticed. "That house," she murmured. "You should not go digging." Eliza pressed her, and the woman leaned closer, her eyes unblinking. "If you hear anything, do not answer. Promise me." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Eliza's skin prickling with cold. Eliza tried to shake it off. That night she asked her friend Mariah to stay over. She needed proof that she was not losing her mind. They waited in the dark, whispering nervous jokes until their words trailed into silence. At 2:13 a.m., the voice came. Eliza stiffened. Mariah sat up, eyes wide. "You heard that, didn't you?" Eliza whispered. The voice called again, stretching Eliza's name with aching slowness. Together they crept into the hallway. The air felt charged, as if the whole house held its breath. Mariah clutched Eliza's arm. Suddenly the door shuddered. The knob twisted violently back and forth, rattling as though someone inside was desperate to get out. Mariah screamed, pulling Eliza away. The rattling stopped, replaced by a thin laugh that seeped through the keyhole, a child's giggle fractured by dust and time. They fled to the bedroom, bolting the door, sitting awake until dawn painted the windows gray. Mariah left the next morning, refusing to return. "You need to leave that place," she said, her voice shaking. But Eliza only shook her head. She had poured everything she owned into this house. Running would not erase what she had heard. It would only follow her, whispering wherever she went. Alone again, she tried to convince herself she was imagining it. She walked through each room, touching walls, steadying her breath. Maybe she was unraveling. Maybe her childhood fears had finally poisoned her mind. Yet when she looked in the mirror, her reflection seemed thinner, her eyes ringed with shadow, her lips moving as though whispering a name she could not hear. Desperate, she pressed her phone against the door that night, determined to record the sound. The knob trembled beneath her palm as the voice whispered her name, soft and steady. When it finished, she stumbled back, replaying the recording. Static. Nothing else. It was as if the voice had spoken only to her, refusing to be captured. The following morning, she carried her phone to the sheriff. Her words poured out in a rush. The whispers, the knock, the laugh, the door rattling. He listened with tired patience, then sighed. Houses settle, wood swells, old places complain in the dark. His voice was even, almost rehearsed. She begged him to check the locked room. He shook his head. Without reason or warrant, it's your responsibility. The house is yours. Whatever is in it is yours, too. That night, exhausted and furious, Eliza stood in the hallway staring at the door. She told herself she would not listen. She told herself she would ignore it. But at 2:13, the whisper came again. This time, it was not her name. It was a plea. "Let me out." Her chest clenched. She screamed back, "Stop!" and the house answered with a groan that rippled through the walls. She staggered backward, nearly tripping. When she looked at the door again, fresh scratches had appeared around the knob, jagged words etched into the wood. "Do not open." Eliza pressed her back against the wall, trembling, torn between fleeing the house and touching the handle once more. The warning glared at her in the dark. She realized then that she was not only being haunted, she was being dared. By the second week, Eliza lived like a shadow inside the house, worn down by nights that bled into mornings. She drifted through the day trembling with fatigue. Each night at 2:13, the whisper returned, patient and precise, carving her name into the dark. Sometimes it crooned softly. Sometimes it pressed the syllables hard enough that the window glass seemed to quiver. Even ordinary sounds turned against her. The tick of her watch became a metronome of dread. The refrigerator hum sounded like a throat trying to speak. She decided she needed proof. On the 9th night, she set her phone on a tripod in the hallway, the lens aimed at the locked door. She sat with her back to the wall, counting her breaths. When the minute turned, the whisper slid through the keyhole. Her name came slow, as if someone were tasting it. The knob quivered once. After the sound faded, she grabbed the phone. The video showed only an empty hall. The audio bled with a sound too close and too heavy. Breathing, as if a person crouched directly in front of the lens and smiled because the camera could not see. She called Mariah and begged her to listen. "You are feeding it every time you listen back," her friend said. "Stop before it knows you." The line went dead. The word invitation formed in Eliza's mind until it sounded like a door opening without her consent. The next night she spread flour from the stair top to the locked room. She wanted something a camera could not mistake. At 2:13, the whisper returned. She kept her eyes on the floor. In the morning, the flour looked smooth. Then she knelt and saw faint lines scrolled through the powder, thin grooves like the strokes of small fingers. Her own palm left wider marks when she pressed it down. She brushed the flour back together and washed her clean hands anyway. She went into town because the house had become too quiet. The cafe bell rang, and conversation stopped for a breath. 2 women watched steam rise from their cups. One said that Eliza had bought the boy's house. The other said that some houses keep their children. Eliza left coins on the counter and stepped into sunlight without tasting the coffee. On the sidewalk, an old man with a cane asked for her address. When she named the street, he tapped the cane twice. "Keep your light on at night," he said. "Do not answer if it speaks from the other side." "What happened there?" she asked. "The town buried what it could," he said. "The rest stayed where it was." She went to the library. The same woman lowered her head. "If it speaks, do not answer," the librarian said. "Has anyone opened the room?" Eliza asked. "Wood swells and hinges rust," the woman replied. "And sometimes a door remembers who closed it." Eliza left with the cold feeling that everyone knew a story and had agreed to recite only the parts that did not include names. Back home, She told herself that force would do what patience had not. She borrowed a crowbar and carried it upstairs at dusk. She wedged the bar against the hinge and pulled. The frame shuddered. The air gathered weight as if the house had braced itself. She hauled until her shoulders shook. The boards under her feet trembled, as if the structure had decided that she could move, but the door would not. The bar slipped and struck her shoulder. Pain flared, and the tool clanged to the floor. She sank beside it and let her forehead rest against the wood, pulse trapped and loud. She wanted to leave. She also wanted to know. She set the tool aside, washed the ache from her hands, and told herself she would keep watch rather than sleep. Sleep took her anyway. She woke with her cheek against the quilt and the room holding its breath. No whisper came. Silence pressed outward until it felt like water against the walls. Relief rose. Then the blanket slid an inch down her legs. "Who is there?" she whispered. The answer came in the exact shape of her words, but from just behind her ear. "Who is there?" Her own breath smoked pale. The bed dipped, not with weight, but with intent. She screamed. The walls answered with a low sound, like timbers grinding far below the plaster. Glass fell and broke on the floor. She grabbed the flashlight and ran into the hall. The crowbar lay where she had left it. The door to the locked room stood ajar. A thin wedge of dark opened into a space that should not have opened at all. Air moved through the gap and carried the smell of mildew and old iron. She raised the beam and aimed it into the opening. Dust floated like pale seeds. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a small figure crouched at floor level, with its head tipped, as if listening. She blinked and saw only darkness pooling into heavier dark. Warm air brushed her cheek, as if something inside the room had leaned very close, and then leaned away again. Something rolled out of the gap and clicked across the boards. It spun and came to rest against her bare foot. She bent and lifted it. It was a small metal car. The paint had peeled in flakes that left islands of red clinging to the roof. The wheels turned when she pressed them with her thumb. A smear of brown red marked the hood as if a child had pushed it through a puddle and then set it on heat to dry. The toy felt colder than the air. Behind her, the door eased shut and clicked as if a lock had been turned from within. She stood with the toy in her hand and tried to slow her breath. "What do you want?" she asked the air. The answer came, but not through the wood. It slid out of her lungs with the breath she let go. "You found it." The words were soft and satisfied, and they didn't belong to her. The car dropped and rang hollow. It spun and lay still, pointing toward the door. She backed along the wall until the plaster held her upright. She did not pick up the toy again. The house had changed its language. It had finished with whispers that could be doubted, and with tricks that faded at dawn. It wanted to put objects into her hands, and let those objects speak in other rooms, where strangers could confirm they were real. It wanted her to carry evidence. It wanted her to walk back into town with something it had given, and ask for a story people had tried not to tell. Downstairs, the refrigerator hummed. The night pressed its palm to the windows. Eliza pictured the old man with his cane and the librarian with her eyes on the date stamp. She pictured the child who had brushed her leg and the way the mother had pulled him back as if Eliza were a wire that might spark. She thought about the flower and the lines that had been too small to belong to her. She thought about the way the door had opened just enough to give and then had closed with a decision that did not include her. She looked at the toy on the floor and felt the pull of it like a tide. She picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it might bite, and carried it downstairs in a hand that would not stop shaking. In the kitchen, she set it on the table and watched the metal catch the light. In the morning, she told the empty room, She would take it into town and ask the questions no one wanted to answer. Morning light did nothing to erase what Eliza had seen. The toy car remained on the kitchen table where she had placed it, metal dulled, wheels stiff. She had sworn to herself she would not touch it again, but its presence infected the air. Every time she crossed the room, her eyes were dragged back to it. It seemed less like an object than a waiting gesture, as if someone had extended a hand and would not lower it until she responded. By mid-morning, she wrapped the toy in a cloth and carried it to town. She told herself she would force someone else to see it, to acknowledge it. At the library, she unwrapped the car and set it gently on the counter. The librarian froze. Her lips parted, then pressed together. "Where did you get this?" Eliza whispered. "In the house." The woman's face drained of color. That belonged to the boy. He would push it up and down the pews on Sunday. She shoved it back into Eliza's hands. "Take it away. Some things do not leave because we remember. Some things stay because they were never allowed to." Her voice broke. "Go before it follows you here." Eliza left, clutching the cloth bundle to her chest, her stomach hollow. She stopped outside the cafe for air, but two women at a table turned away as she passed, lowering their voices. A child tugged his mother's sleeve and pointed at the car. The mother slapped his hand down sharply. The boy's voice carried anyway. "That's his toy." Eliza hurried home, her skin crawling. That night, she placed the car on her bedside table. She wanted to prove it could not act without her fear. She stared at it until her eyes blurred. At 2:13, the whisper arrived, softer than before, almost coaxing. "Eliza." The car rattled once, as though stirred by the voice. Her heart ceased. She clenched the blanket, refusing to move. The whisper grew more insistent. "You know me." The toy rolled slowly to the edge of the table, balanced as if waiting to fall. Eliza snapped, shouting, "Who are you?" The room held its breath. Then a second voice, faint and fragile, rose beneath the first. "Help me." The car dropped. She lunged forward, catching it before it hit the floor. The metal burned cold in her palm. A rush of air pressed against her face, almost warm, like someone had leaned close. The voice surged louder, circling her name with urgency, with hunger. She stumbled back, clutching the toy, shaking her head. "Stop. Stop." The door at the end of the hallway groaned. She turned, blood pounding in her ears. It shuddered in its frame, rattling like someone striking from the inside. She backed away until her spine hit the wall. The toy slipped from her hand and clattered against the boards. The whispers fell silent. Eliza stood frozen, chest heaving, until her gaze fell on the powder she had scattered days earlier. She had forgotten to sweep it completely. Now, under the dim light, new marks glistened in the dust. She dropped to her knees. Loops and scratches crossed each other in frantic strokes. When her eyes adjusted, she saw the letters forming. Her name. Eliza, carved by fingers too small, too deliberate to belong to memory alone. Her breath broke into ragged sobs. The house was no longer whispering secrets behind a locked door. It was reaching into her space, calling her by name, placing proof in her hands. It had given her the toy. Now, it had written to her directly. She stumbled back into her room, slammed the door, and pressed her body against it. The toy still lay in the hallway, waiting. The dust still held her name. For the first time, she understood this was not only a haunting, it was a recognition. The house had chosen her. Eliza had not slept for 2 nights. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the toy car sliding across the floor and heard her own name carved into the dust. She told herself she had reached the end of endurance. Either she would uncover the truth, or the house would consume her. There could be no more waiting. On the 3rd morning, she carried the toy car back into town, forcing herself toward the library again. The librarian paled when she saw Eliza approach. "I told you to leave it," she whispered. Eliza slammed the car onto the counter. "Tell me who he was." The woman trembled, words spilling out before she could stop them. "His name was Daniel. He was 9. They said he ran away, but no one ever believed it. His parents locked him in when he disobeyed. One night, he never came out again." Eliza's stomach twisted. The librarian clapped a hand over her mouth as if she had spoken a curse. "Take that thing and never bring it here again," she hissed. Eliza gathered the car, heart pounding, and fled before the woman's shaking hands could push her away. The name followed her home. Daniel. She whispered it aloud, tasting it on her tongue. For the first time, the whisper at 2:13 changed. It answered. Yes. Her body froze. The air rippled cold around her. She whispered again. Daniel. The door at the end of the hallway groaned in response. She clutched the toy and forced herself forward. Her hand touched the knob. It burned with a cold that bit to the bone. She twisted hard. The lock resisted, then snapped with a sound that tore the silence apart. The door yawned open. The stench of mildew and iron flooded out, thick and cloying. Dust spiraled upward, caught in her flashlight beam. She stepped inside. The room was small, bare except for a mattress rotting against one wall and scribbles carved into the plaster. Childish drawings of houses, trees, and a stick figure with arms stretched wide. Words repeated again and again. Let me out. Eliza's throat closed. She turned the beam to the far corner. A pile of objects waited there. Toys rusted with age. Shoes too small to belong to anyone grown. Her knees weakened. The whispers filled the room now. Layered voices of a boy desperate to be heard. They surged around her, overlapping, almost forming words. She pressed her palm against the wall, tracing the scratches. Daniel, she whispered. I am here. The voices stopped. Silence spread. Then one voice spoke clear. Help me! The floor groaned. Eliza turned, and for an instant she saw him. A thin boy crouched by the mattress, hair matted, eyes dark and hollow. He stared at her with a mixture of hope and terror. Then he vanished, leaving only the smell of damp earth. Eliza staggered backward, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic clawed her chest. She threw herself at the knob, but it would not budge. The whispers rose into a chorus, circling the room, tugging at her breath. The toy car rattled in her pocket. She yanked it out, holding it high. The voices hushed. If you want to leave, she cried. Show me how? A gust slammed into her, knocking her to her knees. The flashlight clattered away, beam sweeping across the wall. It landed on a section of plaster where the paint blistered. Eliza crawled toward it. She dug at the surface with trembling nails. The plaster crumbled. Behind it, the cavity of the wall gaped open. Inside lay bones, small and brittle, tangled with scraps of fabric. A child's skeleton, hidden and forgotten. Her scream tore from her throat. She reached with shaking hands, touching the remains. The whispers softened into sobs, wrapping around her like a plea. She whispered, I see you. The sobs swelled, filling the room with grief so heavy she thought her chest would collapse. The door behind her shook violently. She whirled. The wood buckled inward as if something outside was pounding to be let in. A new voice joined, deeper, harsh, nothing like the boy. It snarled, Leave him. Eliza staggered back, clutching the toy. The room tilted, floorboards shivering. She realized with a jolt that this was not only Daniel's voice. The house carried the echo of those who had locked him away, the parents who had silenced him. Their cruelty had soaked into the walls, lingering as a shadow that would not release him. Eliza pressed the toy car against the bones. Take it, she whispered. It is yours. The sobs quieted. For a heartbeat, the air held still. Then the toy rolled gently from her hand, settling among the bones. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied. The whispers shifted, softening into something like relief. "Thank you," Daniel's voice breathed. The door rattled again, harder. The deeper voice roared, "He is mine!" The walls cracked, plaster splitting. Shadows spilled across the floor like ink. Eliza's chest seized. She scrambled to her feet. "No," she shouted. "He is not yours anymore!" The air howled. The shadow lunged, a mass of black that surged toward the bones. Eliza threw herself across them, shielding them with her body. Her voice tore raw from her throat. "You kept him here. You silenced him. But he is heard now. He is free." Light burst through the cracks. The shadow shrieked, pulling back. The walls shuddered, the floor buckling. Eliza clung to the remains, whispering Daniel's name again and again. The deeper voice howled in rage, then fractured into silence. The door burst open. Light from the hallway poured in, scattering the dark. Eliza staggered up, coughing, cradling the toy car now resting quietly among the bones. Daniel's presence brushed against her one last time, gentle as a hand on her shoulder. Then it was gone. She sank against the wall, sobbing. The room smelled less of mildew now, more of dust and emptiness. The air was still. She knew the boy had been released, but the cost lingered in her trembling body. When she finally stood, the scribbles on the walls looked different. Not pleas, but memories, softened in the dim light. She stepped into the hallway. The house groaned once, low, then stilled. For the first time since she had arrived, it felt like it was breathing out instead of in. Eliza closed the door gently behind her. The lock no longer held. The house stood silent in the wake of what had been uncovered. Eliza remained in the upstairs hallway long after the voices ceased, her hands still trembling from holding the toy car. The door to the locked room hung open, no longer a barrier, but a passage into grief that had finally been named. Behind it lay bones, dust, and years of denial. For the first time since she had crossed the threshold of this house, she felt that the silence belonged not to cruelty, but to release. By noon, the authorities filled the house. She led them to the small room, guiding them past the splintered frame. Flashlights swept the corners, where scribbles marked plaster and rusted toys lay forgotten. Men in gloves bent low, lifting delicate fragments of bone into evidence boxes. The smell of mildew and iron was replaced by the faint sting of disinfectant. Outside, neighbors pressed against the fence. Some stared with wide eyes, others bowed their heads. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the truth the town had buried began to breathe in daylight. Eliza watched from the porch as cameras clicked and officers carried out remnants of a childhood stolen. She felt no triumph. What rose in her chest was sorrow, deep and relentless. Daniel had been hidden for decades, locked away until only whispers carried his name. Now his story was carried by strangers who would write reports and file photographs. But at least it was no longer erased. The sheriff approached her, face drawn and pale. "You did right," he said quietly. He glanced at the toy car she still held wrapped in cloth. That should be preserved. Eliza looked down at the weight in her hands and nodded. She did not tell him how it still pulsed cold against her palm, how at times she swore she felt a faint echo of breath when she touched it. Some truths were too fragile to hand to lawmen. In the following days, the town shifted. The library displayed a single framed article about Daniel, no longer tucked away in archives. The old man with the cane stopped her on the street. His eyes were wet as he said, "We should have spoken sooner." Children should not carry silence. Eliza could not answer. She walked away with her throat tight, carrying both anger and pity for the town that had chosen quiet over justice. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed. Nights came without the heavy pressure at 2:13. No whisper slid through the keyhole, no laughter scraped her nerves. She slept for the first time without fear, yet dreams of the small room lingered. In them, she saw Daniel not as bones, but as a boy who wanted to run, who pushed a toy car across the floor and looked up with hope that someone would open the door. One evening, she returned to the upstairs hallway alone. The room had been cleared, but the words remained on plaster. "Let me out." She traced the letters with her fingertips, whispering that he had been heard, that his name would not vanish again. The air stayed still, neither heavy nor kind, only quiet. She felt the weight lift from her chest. Weeks later, she sat on the porch as dusk settled, the sycamores rustling in the wind. In her lap rested the toy car, its paint chipped, its wheels stiff. She set it gently on the railing and lit a candle beside it. The flame flickered, reflecting off metal. For a moment, she thought she felt a brush of presence, light as a child running past into the distance. She whispered his name once more, not in fear, but in farewell. The candle burned steady. The toy did not move. The silence that followed was whole. Eliza did not remain in the house long after the truth surfaced. Once the investigators carried away the bones and the neighbors drifted home, she gathered her belongings. She paused only once more in the upstairs hallway, where the carved words still scarred the plaster. "Let me out." Her fingers brushed across the grooves, and she whispered, "You are free now." Then she closed the door gently, knowing it no longer needed a lock. In her new apartment, the toy car rested on a shelf. It no longer chilled her skin or rattled in the night. It sat quiet, an artifact rather than a threat, its chipped paint catching light when the sun set across the window. Sometimes she caught herself staring at it, not with dread, but with a sense of responsibility. Memory, she realized, is not only about the past, it is about what we choose to carry forward. The silence in her life now was different. It was not the suffocating hush of secrets, but the kind of quiet that follows truth. She slept deeply. She woke to birdsong instead of whispers. And yet, each time she passed the shelf, she remembered that a boy's life had been swallowed because silence was chosen over courage. It reminded her that cruelty often thrives not through violence alone, but through the refusal to speak. One evening, Eliza lit a single candle beside the toy car. The flame wavered, painting the room in gold. For an instant, she felt a lightness, as if a child had raced past, laughter carried on a breeze. She smiled through her tears, whispering his name one last time. Daniel. The flame steadied, and the toy remained still. The room was whole, free of shadows. Eliza knew she had done what was needed. She had broken the silence. And now the story belonged not only to her, but to anyone who had listened. Because every locked room carries a question. Every whisper holds a choice. When the world falls quiet around you, will you turn away, or will you open the door?